Hello and welcome to the second discussion for Monday's class, April 27th. I wanted to talk a little bit about Lorraine Hedtke's work on bereavement support groups. Sunderland just briefly introduced the idea of support groups, and Hedtke gives a fuller picture of what support groups might look like. There's actually quite a lot of psychological training that goes into facilitating support groups, but there's also some church-based kind of initiatives that are done by congregation members where people kind of supervise one another, and they're kind of it's a story-sharing approach. So let's talk a little bit about Lorraine Hedtke's work. You got a previous chapter where Lorraine Hedtke was from this book, from her book Remembering Lives, which was co-written with John Winslade. And in that book, Lorraine Hedtke was talking about how to prepare people for death through kind of narrative therapy conversations. And in this article, we're going to be talking a little bit about how you use narrative therapy principles in a bereavement counseling setting where there's a bereavement support group. So narrative therapy, the general idea, it was developed by Michael White and David Epstein in the 1990s, and it was influenced by the theory of Michel Foucault. And so there was generally a kind of suspicion of power in the therapeutic space and a critique of, so when you lead someone through a feeling journey or through a therapeutic journey, narrative therapists say that you're always kind of co-constructing their lives. So every time you share a story, you're actually building a certain kind of narrative about that person. And there's always a risk for narrative therapists that you'll use your power against someone. So there's a risk that you will harm someone by... So maybe think about the rabbit cake example from the start of the semester where the therapist counseled the teenager and told her that she didn't grieve in a real way because she was a teenager. She hadn't learned how to grieve yet. So you might think of other examples where you expect someone to kind of quickly progress through Kubler-Ross's stages of grief and then be at the end of a grief journey in like 12 months or something like that. All of these are ways that kind of grief becomes a technology of social control, and the narrative therapists are concerned that every time we have a conversation with someone, there's a risk that there's some kind of social control going on through the ways that we're kind of guiding or shaping the conversation. Another important idea from this article is the notion of continuing bonds. So each time, it seems like narrative therapy, in terms of its orientation, is a lot like the track 2 conversations where you foster remembrance of the dead, and it really has to do with how constructive that process becomes. So for someone like Hedtke, someone influenced by narrative therapy, you're kind of responsible, in a sense, to keep the dead's memory alive. And you do that in certain ways, and you do that in certain kinds of conversations that you might have. And so there's not as much of an emphasis on relinquishment of the lost person or reorganization of the life after someone is dead. There's really no complicated grief concept here. There's really just the idea that even complicated grief itself, or another phrase like that, traumatic bereavement, could be a strategy to control someone, to push them through a grief journey too quickly. And so those are the kinds of concerns that Lorraine Hedtke is working from as she introduces this bereavement support group. So if you want to take a look at others who are working in this vein, Michael White is probably the predominant name, and I did my dissertation on his work. And David Epstein is also a really interesting voice too. So you can see, given narrative therapy's distinctive commitments and their distinctive framework, how how a bereavement support group might go. So Lorraine Hedtke gives an example of introducing the dead to your group. So she says that you actually want to, first notice that the dead are really clearly named there. It's not a euphemism or someone who's passed away. But there is a sense that you're kind of keeping them alive through memory. So she talks about how you kind of you set the stage for what a person might come to mean in your life. And the way you facilitate bereavement support conversations is a kind of way of giving credit for someone's presence in your life. There's a strong sense in which of like you want to not pay it forward, but pay it backwards in a sense. Giving credit for someone's presence is a way of evoking them and a way of making them real. So it might be like the continuing bonds notion or the track 2 notion of bereavement that we learned about. There's a no advice policy in her group, and there's expectations of confidentiality and emotional safety. And if you've worked much or if you've been much in these kinds of groups, you know that has to be kind of rigorously enforced. Because when people get anxious, they tend to give each other advice, or they tend to side talk or speak down on each other's experience. So there's a strong emphasis in narrative therapy on continuity. So death is just one, the death story is only one part of this broader narrative. And so you could ask from a narrative therapy question like, how would you want your loved one to be remembered? And you hear narrative therapy places a big emphasis on conversations about meaning and value. So what do you give meaning to? What do you hold valuable? It's not a pathological kind of approach to therapy. So you want to hear about connections, the places where the relationship has meaning or value. And these kind of open up to rich connections. Who was the person who died in relation to you? Can you introduce me to your loved one? So you notice that in narrative therapy, it's very much in the present. Someone is introducing you to someone who's deceased. So there's a way in which narrative therapy is like a performative speech, a speech that kind of creates what it wants to foster. And narrative therapy has the idea that we have, we're living by a set of stories that have been limiting to us. Maybe the story about being an unfinished griever or a bad mourner. And narrative therapy wants to undo those stories and see the power and control behind them, and then help you to kind of create your own story. So Hedtke uses narrative therapy's emphasis on power to say that there's been an overcorrection in the discussion of chronological time in grief. So the idea that you would pass through a certain set of stages in a few months, or be on your way, or get through your grief. Lorraine Hedtke is really concerned about who defines truth and makes such decisions. And she says what's at stake here on page 57, telling only a single story about death further limits the points of possible connection. So the story is often told of how one's life used to be in the grief narrative, but she wants to make sure that we don't dismiss the ongoing connection. So not only did the deceased matter in the past, they continue to matter. So you can ask questions about what ways do they have of continuing to remember the person? Are there special places or rituals for doing that? There's really, I think, a big emphasis in narrative therapy on helping people to tell more stories, more rich stories, and there's kind of an emphasis on empowering through stories. So there's certain kinds of stories in narrative therapy that are more empowering than others. And the general idea of this article is that people, is similar to the rest of the class, people who've lost a loved one generally want to talk about them, but they feel expected to move on. And these bereavement support groups done in a narrative fashion are a powerful tool to help people tell the stories of their loved one for longer than other people might want to listen. And then you can put it in the third person. You can ask about the deceased and say, what would your deceased say about what you've uncovered, and how you've answered these questions. Would he like the stories you've selected or prefer other ones as well? You can do journaling exercises and other aspects as well. So narrative therapy has a lot of strengths to offer in the bereavement area, and a lot of them have to do with moving beyond a pathological framework. I would say some of the concerns about a narrative approach, and you might have picked up on this as well, is that there is so much of an emphasis on the present and continuing bonds and track to ongoing connections that sometimes the reality of the death seems to be minimized. And there's also maybe not enough attention to the family process. So there's a sense in which each griever is somewhat isolated or individualized in a narrative therapy approach, despite the important strengths that it gives. So I wanted to give you, through this reading, a glimpse of what narrative therapy looks like as it structures bereavement support group conversations. And it might give you some ideas of how you would want to do a similar thing in your ministry, or just some tendencies that you would want to pick up and then implement in whatever kind of ministry you might be doing in the future. Okay, thank you, and I hope you're doing well.